Okay, well, I'm going to do a brief introduction of the Texas Coastal Prairie Initiative. So I'll go ahead and start that. And I hope everyone will be admitted as soon as the star of the hour starts his presentation. But thank you, everyone, for attending. I'm Elisa Donovan. I'm with the Coastal Prairie Conservancy, and we are the lead partner in the Texas Coastal Prairie Initiative. An initiative that we embarked on back in 2022. So we're just entering our fifth year, and it was planned to be a 5-year initiative. And so we're grateful to be able to report on what's happened, and especially some of the grassland bird trends that we uncovered through the program. Oh gosh. There we go. Okay. So Texas Coastal Prairie Initiative, it's a landscape level conservation program. So we, the Coastal Prairie Conservancy, is active mostly in Harris and Waller counties to the west of Houston. That's where we started, but we've expanded into a 9-county area. But working with our partners, we realized there's a lot of coastal prairie that wasn't being conserved. If you look at all these counties and where the conserved lands were, just very, in some cases, just a few hundred acres. And so we really wanted to replicate what we had done on the Katy Prairie and have large, contiguous, protected areas. And when we say large, we're talking um, 5,000 acres to 10,000 acres that are all connected together, maybe even 20,000 acres in some places. And so in order to do that, we're looking to do conservation easements to ensure that those lands are permanently protected. And we're also working with landowners to improve their habitat quality. And when we designed this, we thought about the kinds of species that rely on the coastal prairie. So some of them are upland species, some are wetland species, others rely on some of the riverine corridors. And so we settled on this group of focus species, which includes some grassland birds as well as other species. It's a partner initiative, so we have partnered with all kinds of groups. You can see I'm not going to list them all today, but we have nonprofit organizations focused on conservation, particular species, as well as research institutions, government agencies, um, and just it's really been a collection of lots of groups with different interests. We do this through NRCS funding, the Natural Resources Conservation Service from the U.S. Department of Agriculture has this program. So we did apply and were able to use this funding. And we use this to work with landowners to enter conservation easements. To date, we were able to enter agreements with 6 landowners, and it's over 5,398 acres, and that value of funding to them is over $4.5 million. To date, we've closed 3 projects, and the other 3 are pending. They're making their way through the closing process with NRCS. We are also doing habitat management activities with our partner Wildlife Habitat Federation. They have helped landowners and producers enter habitat plans to do things like prescribe burns, improve their grazing practices, restore native grasslands through seeding and controlling invasive species. And we are right now, we had a little bit of funding left, and so we have our final project pre-screening underway now, and then we will have spent all the money. So we're really thrilled that it's been so successful with landowners and producers applying and getting their projects on the ground. The other part of this are partner contributions. For every dollar that is funded by NRCS, the partners bring their own projects into the initiative, whether they're funded through other federal sources, state sources, or private philanthropy or landowner donations. That funding is an important part of the initiative as well. And I just want to give a special thanks to Armand Bayou Nature Center, Galveston Bay Foundation, Texas Agricultural Land Trust, and their public and private funders and donors that have made these other projects happen, also benefiting our area and coastal prairie ecosystem. when we do the initiative, it really is a partner collaborative. The first part of it was conservation planning to figure out where we wanted to focus. That group's been working to update. We've done a lot of outreach. Bethany Fauché, who's on the call, I'll turn it over to her in a second. She's been responsible for our conferences and our landowner workshops. We also have a website, prairiepartner.org. You can access with the QR code. We mail postcards. Then we have a whole process, a different group of people that helps us evaluate projects, pre-screen, make sure that they're eligible for the program, whether it's for easements or habitat management. And then another group helps implement to get the landowners into the doors of FSA and doing site visits and getting the applications together and get them contracted and underway. And then the last piece, which is why we're here today, is reporting. We do outcomes reporting, and that includes social outcomes, which sort of things like who have we reached through our programs, et cetera. But then grassland bird monitoring. So enough about me and the initiative. Now I'm going to turn it over to Bethany to introduce our speaker today. Bethany?
All right. Thanks, Elisa. Welcome, everybody. And a bit of webinar logistics. Also, I'm muting everyone as you enter the talk. And you can type your questions in the chat for Wyatt at the close, and we will have time for Q&A at the end. So just hold your questions or type them in the chat. Either way, we'll have time for Q&A after Wyatt closes his presentation. So I have the pleasure of introducing Wyatt this evening. Wyatt is a sanctuary manager for Houston Audubon. He's been on staff with Houston Audubon since the end of 2021. I bet many of you have met Wyatt. He's based on the wonderful High Island and Bolivar Peninsula Shorebird Sanctuary. Wyatt has been a birder basically his whole life, growing up in Southwest U.S. He got his Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Ecology from New Mexico State in 2019. And he has, make sure I said that right, and you can correct me if I got that wrong, Wyatt. Wyatt's also done some amazing research over the years. When I first found out about Wyatt, and he was recommended to us for this position, leading our grassland bird monitoring efforts. He was recommended by several leaders in our ornithology community in Houston. And when I read up on him, I was very intrigued that he got to study the spoon-billed sandpipers in Russia in a preserve I cannot pronounce. So maybe Wyatt, you can tell us about that too. But we're very happy with Wyatt's work. Wyatt's been leading the grassland bird surveys, which basically follow breeding bird survey methodology. He's been leading those for 3 breeding seasons, targeting the grassland birds that are of special significance for the Texas Coastal Prairie Initiative. And he's going to highlight his findings over the last 3 seasons this evening. So with that, Wyatt, I'll let you take the stage.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I kind of very early in my birding career, I my mentor kind of took me under his wing and showed me breeding bird surveys, which is basically kind of a point count methodology that the USGS created in the 1960s throughout the United States. That basically is the gold standard for measuring trends and status of different breeding birds in North America. And so since that point, I've kind of become a little obsessed with point counts. And so when the fine folks at the Coastal Prairie Conservancy asked, hey, would you like to do some point counts for us? I had to say yes. I also really love grassland birds. I think there's something, I don't think that people necessarily in Texas, I think people do recognize grassland birds for what they are. But I think a lot of other folks in other places don't necessarily recognize the beauty of grassland birds. And having wide open spaces with these wonderful birds kind of existing and singing and doing their thing, it's a really nice thing. And so the efforts of this project have been really exciting because we're basically looking at how private land management of certain areas can benefit grassland birds. And so with that, we can go to the next slide. Basically, kind of an overview of, I'm going to walk through, the kind of the logistics of the different routes and the methodology that we used to complete all these surveys. And then I'm going to walk through some of the kind of highlights and biggest, most dramatic sort of trends that we found. There are a lot of focal species, so I'm not actually going to go through every single one of the focal species because otherwise we'd be here till 10 o'clock and people would be falling asleep. So we'll go kind of the ones that I think really embody sort of the trends that we saw throughout this 3-year period. So this is a map of where the routes that I completed were located. You'll notice in red are the actual routes, and then you'll notice 3 big yellow squares that kind of trap the one red squiggle in each region. And so those yellow squares or polygons are the Texas Coastal Prairie Initiative focal regions. And so those are our treatments. So basically that is where this conservation land was located. And the routes are essentially just public roads that ran adjacent to that protected conserved land. And basically the main focus was East Galveston Bay and the Colorado River Prairie. And then I also did the treatment route for the Victoria Prairie, but I believe another organization was in charge of the control. So I have half the data for that one, and I'm not going to harp too much on that route just because I don't have the exact the control to compare to. But that was a really fun route because it was kind of more, a little bit more of a unique habitat compared to the other two. Next slide, please. So Galveston Bay, East Galveston Bay, excuse me. Basically, the 2 routes were, the control route was Fairview Road up to North Pear Orchard, which is the kind of upper squiggle there, and then the lower squiggle route is the control, which is just 1985, which is the road. If you ever birded Jocelyn Ungray National Wildlife Refuge, that's the road that before you get to the refuge, you look off to the right in the spring, and there's probably a bunch of buff-breasted sandpipers out there. It's both of these routes had a lot of either rangeland or rice farms, which is a little bit different than the other route in that there isn't a whole lot of ag land aside from rice. But in terms of wildlife habitat in our region, rice fields are actually incredibly important because they're pretty low input in terms of pesticide, and they support a lot of aquatic invertebrates that shorebirds and other grassland birds can take advantage of, depending on the various depths of the water. So one of the, for example, mottled duck, this is a really important area for mottled ducks because they have that. When there's water, they can take advantage of that to nest. But really for shorebirds, having that water for mottled ducks means that there's water for shorebirds. And if there isn't water on the landscape, all of those shorebirds that pass through here, the buff-breasted sandpipers, the upland sandpipers, the whimbrels, they don't have a place to go. And so on the Central Flyway and on the Pacific Flyway in California, rice farming is actually one of the most important ag stopover habitats for shorebirds. But then moving westward to our next transect, Colorado River, I think this was Colorado River North was the term for it because it also included some of the land, land of like Atwater Prairie Chicken National Wildlife Refuge. Unlike the East Galveston Bay routes, there weren't as many rice fields here. It was more like cropland. So, for example, that control route it had quite a bit of corn and sorghum, especially in 2025 and 2023. And you can definitely kind of see that difference in the number of birds that we're seeing. Most of this isn't irrigated cropland necessarily. They rely on rainfall. And so in years when we have a lot of rainfall, or really depending on when we get the rainfall, that's when they're able to plant, and that's when the crops really grow up. And so in this route, I'll give away a little bit of the surprise. This route was very influenced by when we got rain, and the bird numbers were influenced by when we got rain. But these routes were kind of interesting because they're as that sort of line of aridity moves eastward. So if you think about historically the 100th parallel, which is just west of the I-35 corridor, that used to be kind of the edge of tallgrass prairie and, where we'd have a lot of these species like LeConte sparrows. They like to winter in tallgrass prairie habitat, the black oak, or excuse me, blackland prairie oak savanna. Um, but as we've used a lot of, the groundwater and as, climate has kind of shifted, that line has moved further east. So the I-35 corridor is now kind of that line. And so we've seen species like greater roadrunner, in this part of the coastal prairie, at least, common ground dove and ladderback woodpecker have sort of shifted eastward. And so on this route, I had ladderback woodpecker and downy woodpecker kind of side by side, which is really interesting. Not focal species, but it's interesting to see how those birds have kind of adapted to this landscape that's really very modified by the agriculture. And then our final route in the Victoria Prairie. This one was a lot of fun. Like I said, I won't spend too much time talking about the results from this one just because I don't have the control to compare it directly to. But this is right on again, as habitats have shifted, we're right on that southern brushland habitat of like San Antonio South into the valley and the coastal prairie. And so on this route, like at the very beginning of the route, I would get common parake because you start kind of before sunrise. So it's still kind of dark, and there'd be common nighthawks and common parakes calling. Right where you can kind of see where that river comes in, that river riparian area comes in sort of a third of the way through. At that bend, I'd often have white-tipped dove, and that's about as far northeast as white-tipped dove gets in Texas currently. And then things like scissor or swallowtail kite at the very end and that other riparian corridor. So, in the first year when there was a lot of rain and we had just gotten out of kind of a dry spell, there was a cassin sparrow singing at the beginning of the route, which is really interesting. So this is in particular kind of a crossroads, and one of the unique sort of threats to this particular area that I saw and noticed during these routes was energy development. So in this past summer when I did the route, the first 5 to 8 points were incredibly hard to survey because there was a literal nonstop parade of traffic driving down a road that I had seen maybe 2 cars total on the prior 2 routes, or in 2024 and 2023. And that was because they were putting in, I think it was a wind farm to the north, and all of the contractors drove down this road first thing in the morning. I made the mistake of doing it on a Monday, but it was a little bit of a shock. And there's a lot of development happening to the north in Lavaca County, and this was basically the fastest way for them to get up there. But next slide, please. So a little bit of the background. For those who are unfamiliar with point counts, basically it's basically what it sounds like. You have a transect, which is a predetermined route, and you are conducting a count at points at an even interval throughout that transect. And so one of the important things for consistency's sake is that you run the routes at about the same time. And so the window for breeding birds in Texas is basically May 15th to June 30th. Any later, and a lot of birds are basically done. Within that time frame, for the most part, I was able to do most of these routes about the same time. So, for example, at the East Galveston Bay routes, I basically did at the very beginning of that window because I kind of had to juggle. Not only did I do these routes, but I also do 5 breeding bird survey routes. And so my May and June, every weekend was basically scheduled out. Like I have to go to this place to do these routes. And so this was a nice one because those the start points for those are about 15 minutes from where I live in High Island. And it was a nice break from after driving halfway across the state to do a breeding bird survey somewhere else. So East Galveston Bay was usually right around the 15th, 16th, 17th. And um, the Colorado River surveys tended to be towards either the mid or end of June, excuse me. Um, Victoria kind of bounced around a little more depending, because I do have a breeding bird survey route out near there. So I try to keep that consistent. All of the points are a little over 5 miles apart, or excuse me, half a mile apart, 0.5 miles apart. Um, so the entire route comes out to just a little over 14 and a half miles. Some points were further than the 0.5 just because there wasn't a way to pull off, um, or you had to get onto a highway and it just wasn't worth stopping and you wouldn't be able to hear anything. Um, for this particular these surveys had a pretty busy protocol, which is good. There was a lot of data collected. So they were 6 minutes, and within that 6 minutes, they're what's called a removal distance sample. So when I would hear a bird that was a focal bird, basically, I'd have my timer going, and you would note the minute in which you heard it. So the first minute, the second minute, the third minute, the fourth minute. And then with a rangefinder, you would take an estimate of how far that bird was to you. And all of that kind of goes into the science of estimating basically what you're not seeing. So the assumption is that you are not going to detect 100% of the birds in 6 minutes. It's just not going to happen. If you stayed there for 20 minutes, you're going to find one more bird than you would have. The probability is you would find at least one more bird than you would have if you were only there for 3 minutes or 5 minutes or 6 minutes. So when you do some of the higher level modeling of population estimates and density estimates, that's where a lot of this other data plays a role because you're essentially predicting how hard it is to find the birds, the detection probability. So things like dickcissels or eastern meadowlarks, they have a pretty high detection probability because they like to sit up and sing, and they sing loudly and often. Even bobwhites, they're probably kind of in the middle. You hear them, but it's really hard to tell how far away they are, and they kind of move around just a little bit, and but they like to call back and forth. So if there's one bobwhite calling and there's more than one in the area, you'll probably hear the other bobwhite. The far end of the spectrum is something like a mottled duck, which isn't really making any noise. And by the time that we're doing the surveys, probably has chicks or is getting ready to have chicks. So they're pretty hard to find. And so that's all kind of baked into how you then use this data to say, okay, this is what the populations are. In addition to all of that, I also took vegetation metrics. So looking at, basically the percentage of, what's grass, what's kind of shrubby or forbs. So things like mesquite or, baccharis or other shrubs that aren't necessarily trees. And then how much of it is trees? Because if the point is right next to a river, a riparian area, and you're surrounded by oaks, you probably don't expect to, hear or see very many eastern meadowlarks. And so, and the height is important too. And I think really the grass height became a proxy for rainfall. If we have a ton of rainfall, or if something isn't super heavily grazed, you're going to have tall grass. If you have very little rainfall or it's super heavily grazed, you're not going to have very much grass. And that's going to influence things like, particularly like eastern meadowlarks. They tend to like a little bit of grass, or northern bobwhites because they need cover. They're pretty easy food for a hawk, if there's no grass for them to hide in. So And like I said before, we had treatment and non-treat or in control, excuse me. And so treatment were the priority conservation lands, and the control were, I shouldn't say non-priority, but they were lands that did not have conservation easements or weren't protected. So it was basically just regular private lands that are the conservation is not a priority versus lands that are being, in theory, managed for grassland birds. Um, and I didn't note it in my bullets, but we started Transx half an hour before sunrise. So um, lots of coffee in early mornings, but that's kind of fun. And that also sort of plays into when you're modeling a lot of this data. I always ran the Transx from the same start point to the same end point. So each year I'm going back to the exact same spot and I'm starting half an hour before sunset at point number one, and you're going to the end. Um, and so that basically controls for when birds are most active. And the idea is that you would finish these routes, within 5 to 6 hours of sunrise, which for these routes wasn't terribly difficult. Like I said, there was a lot of that vegetation data, so oftentimes I'd finish doing the bird survey and then spend an extra minute or two collecting the vegetation data. But 30 points is a little bit quicker to get through, even though it's 6 minutes, than doing a 50-point breeding bird survey. So that made these a lot of fun because you could kind of just get through it. And even by the last point, you still had a lot of birds calling, which is kind of nice. Not really always the case on a breeding bird survey when it's, almost 100 degrees and everything stopped singing an hour ago. Next slide, please. So focal species. I'm not going to go through the results for each one of these. Like I said, we'll be here for hours and hours. But I am going to pick the ones that I think kind of embody the different habitat preferences and also just the different trends that we've kind of seen over the last several decades here on the coast and what I saw with these surveys. So we're going to kind of focus on dickcissel, meadowlark, eastern meadowlark, mottled duck, bobwhite, and painted bunting. All of these species are definitely, they do fit into what we would consider prairie birds. But I think what we think of as prairie it's a very broad term, right? So, and that's part of the reason why for um, the the conservation initiative, they selected these species. Things like painted bunting and scissor-tailed flycatcher do really well in mesquite shrubland. Birds like eastern meadowlark, dickcissel, and northern bobwhite don't necessarily do as well they need a little more grass and a little more space. And so looking at how these different birds respond to some of the different conservation actions or even just the climate and the rain that we've been getting, I think is really descriptive of kind of what's going on. So with that, we'll kind of jump into a little bit of what we found. I decided to include the eBird status and trends maps in this presentation for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's a great exercise for anybody if you're bored, on lunch at work and just, want to learn something. Type in your favorite bird into eBird status and trends. You can find it under the science tab on the eBird page. Upper right, click on science, and then plug in the bird and see how it's doing. It's usually not great. So here we have mottled duck. I'll say it now. The size of the circles that you see basically relates to the estimated population at the midpoint of the year that's listed at the top. So for mottled ducks, they took data from a 10-year data set from 2011 to 2021. And the bigger the circle, the more birds that are there. The darker the color, it'll either be red or blue. The darker the color, the more dramatic the change in population. So blue is an increase and red is a decrease. Typically, the really dark red will be somewhere around 30 to 35% for most species. And if it's super pale, kind of pink, a lot of times are super pale blue. A lot of times that change won't necessarily be that much significant than zero. It'll be pretty much, it really hasn't changed that much. Um, but if you look at the upper right and really along the entire coast, mottled ducks are not doing very good. And even in the places where they have shown increases, the size of those circles do not make up for the size of the declining circles, which is a part of the reason why these sorts of programs, like the Texas Coastal Prairie Initiative, are really important. And so that's kind of the going into all of this. That was the trend. Next slide, please. I don't really have a fancy map to show you, and I don't really have a whole lot of fancy data to show you. All I can tell you is I had one model duck each of the years I did the survey, and it was on a different transect. There's a lot that kind of goes into that. For one, again, point counts really aren't designed to detect ducks that are nesting because ducks tend to be very good at, hiding. And, unless you are, a lot of the ways that a lot of the irrigated sort of like rice farms that we have tend to have big embankments around them to hold the water in there. And roads tend to not be higher than those embankments. So it's really hard, even when you're just scanning, to see mottled ducks if they're hanging out on a field. And I want to point out that this is a bird that's declining or has shown a declining trend, but it's a resident species for the most part. There are some mottled ducks that migrate, a little bit in the Great Plains, will breed north of our region. They'll end up sometimes up the Mississippi River Valley, but for the most part, this is a bird that's here all the time. And so it's pay attention to that as you go into some of these other species that don't necessarily have the same migration strategy. But I would argue that this is the most, I'm biased. I'm a shorebird guy. This is probably the most important species in terms of providing an umbrella of habitat for other species, of the focal species listed. Because if you have water on the landscape, you support shorebirds. And there are at least 20 or more species of shorebirds, particularly in throughout the coastal prairie region, from Chambers and Jefferson's County all the way down to Cameron County, that migrate through things like buff-breasted sandpiper and whimbrel and upland sandpiper, all the small colydrous sandpipers. If that habitat isn't on the landscape in the spring or the fall, they don't necessarily make it to the Arctic. Or in the reverse direction, they don't necessarily make it to Brazil or southern South America. And so by creating water on the landscape, whether it's rice farms or it's conservation easement wetlands, that is one of the most important things that we can do in Texas to support migratory shorebirds. And there have been estimates done at, the number of acreage that we need to support the number of shorebirds that come through our region. And we've never been nearly close enough. Usually we get to be, I think, around a third of the acreage that would be necessary to support the hundreds of thousands, the millions of shorebirds that come through. So not a really dramatic result for mottled duck, but I think it's a very important species to keep an eye on and to manage for in these areas. Next slide, please. Bobwhite. Everybody loves bobwhite. Unfortunately, they also are not doing very well. Keep this map in mind when we get to another species in a couple minutes, and I'll point it out. But there's a lot of red, to the west of us. There's a lot of red right around Galveston Bay. Just anecdotally, there used to be wild bobwhites in High Island, and there have not been. I had one in 2024, which is right around when we had a whole bunch of rain, and I started seeing them increase around Anahuac. But they're not doing great, and they don't do as well when you have a lot of shrub encroachment, because like prairie chickens, hawks and predatory birds can sit in shrubs and pretty easily find dopey ground birds that like to announce their presence by sitting on fence posts and calling. But probably more than any of the other focal species, probably aside from mottle duck, I think bobwhite are particularly tied to precipitation. So next slide, please. The good news is over from 2023 to 2025, there was pretty much a across the board dramatic increase in bobwhites on the surveys that I did. The only kind of outlier is the coast. So the only outlier is the Colorado River control route. And so I should have mentioned the abbreviations. EGBC is East Galveston Bay Control. T stands for treatment. CRN is the Colorado River. And then NVP is the North Victoria Prairie. So you can kind of visualize where those maps were earlier. These are the results in this bar chart. And then they're color coded by year. So blue is 2023, orange is 2025, gray is 2025, orange is 2024. We had a lot more rain in 23, 24, and a lot of rain early on in 25 than we had, I think, in previous years. Kind of coming out of that La Nina and pretty dry conditions. And so the bobwhite definitely responded. The Colorado River control route, the timing of the rain was kind of interesting, and I think there was a lot of the cropland was planted earlier because there was rain, and so there really wasn't habitat for bobwhites. And that was a year that I surveyed at the end of June, and so it kind of skewed. That was a little deviation from the control there. But you can see for the most part, 25 had a lot more bobwhites than 23, which was nice to see. And this is another sort of resident species on the coastal prairie. They do move around a little bit, but it's really, I think, more a boom and bust. And another kind of factor, or another observation was bobwhite were found on some of the private lands in northwestern Galveston County, on the mainland there, that were not introduced, and they just kind of made their way onto the property right around 2022, 2023, when we started getting more rain, which is kind of a cool discovery. Next up, I'll show you the actual routes and the detections. So next slide. So the previous slide was the number of individuals that were detected. This is a map of the points where they were detected. And so in theory, you could have a ton of bobwhites, but you could only see them at 2 points. And so yes, your number went up, but they're not actually really spreading out from, where they were seen. So there were 3 points that had bobwhites on the East Galveston Bay routes in 2023. Next slide, please. In 2024, we had quite a few more, especially on the end portion of the treatment route, the bottom red squiggle. And one more, please. And by 2025, last year, there were quite a few. And most of these points typically they'd have at least 2 or 3 bobwhites because they'll be kind of counter calling. And that half mile minimum distance between the points is basically designed so that way you're not recounting birds. And so I should have mentioned it up front, but if I knew that I was hearing a bird or seeing a bird that I had already seen from another point, those birds don't get recounted, because that obviously then your numbers are going to be way high. Next slide, please. And so similarly for Colorado River, the transect on the right is the control. So that's the one that had a lot of basically corn and a little bit of energy development right on that first 90-degree turn. But this was 23. Next slide, please. This is 24, and you can kind of see stuff shuffles around a little more that year. And next slide, please. and this is the final. And it kind of, again, it shifted, but then we kind of filled in, which to me says that not only did they do really well in terms of breeding, but there was enough food and cover that the chicks survived. And so they've kind of filled in those areas in between. Next slide, please. So remember when I said, remember the other map? Like I said earlier, painted buntings do very well in mesquite shrubland habitat. Mesquite encroachment is not a new thing. It's been happening since the 1800s. Basically, once we started putting cattle on the landscape in a very big and widespread sense, we started creating a lot more mesquite. And over time, painted buntings, between that and probably some climate influences too, painted buntings have really kind of marched northward, and not only northward, but up. So you get into the panhandle, and it's not necessarily a matter of going north, it's a matter of going from those rolling plains to the high plains. And so painted buntings, or Texas painted buntings at least, which are, they're, I would say, medium distance migrants. A lot of our painted buntings just pop on down to Mexico and Central America for the winter. They're doing very well. Eastern painted buntings, the birds that breed in sort of the southern Atlantic coast, the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, those birds are not doing as well, at least historically, because they winter in Cuba. So even though they're the same species, they have a very different strategy. And the cage bird trade has done a number on them. And so I think at this point, they've sort of stabilized, and they have been found in even increasing in some areas, but they are in a much more precarious situation than our painted buntings, which are doing pretty well. But again, that kind of drier, shrubbier habitat is the habitat they like. In areas there is a decline in the painted buntings nesting in the kind of the piney woods, and I don't know the answer to that. And in the greater Houston area, I think they've kind of thinned out just because of development. But in the areas that we were surveying, they're doing okay. And in High Island and the Bolivar Peninsula, they've also increased. That may not be a great thing. Just they like mesquite, and they don't mind tallow and privet. And so a lot of these coastal prairie areas that used to be burned regularly and had a little bit of baccharis now have these tallow stands that look and feel a lot like shrubby mesquite in a prairie. And so they can kind of move in and use those areas. Next slide, please. So pretty similarly, painted buntings did pretty well with the greater precipitation, but there was a lot more kind of fluctuation. Part of that probably has to do with when there was rain, because they can be very sort of eruptive breeders. A lot of our painted buntings nest here in Texas and Oklahoma. And then in the fall, they'll do what's called a molt migration. And instead of just going south, a lot of them will fly west. And that's when Arizona birders get excited, because they get to see their painted bunting. And basically the yellow-billed cuckoos do a similar thing, and the orchard orioles also do a similar thing. Basically, they are breeding here and then taking advantage of the monsoons further west. So in West Texas also, the Chihuahuan Desert, they will migrate there to take advantage of all the caterpillars that are coming out, because the rain really tends to fall, July, August. And so I think for these surveys, the timing, when we've had a lot of rain recently, the painted buntings start singing more, and they really gear up to nest. And so that peak, especially for the Galveston treatment route, I think had to do with how wet 2024 was, even before the summer when we had a hurricane that dumped another 10, 15 inches. So, and again, so these are kind of medium distance migrants. They like that shrubbier habitat. And so the habitat that bobwhites might not like. And also they're leaving here in the winter. So they aren't necessarily here all the time, but they're going to places that are relatively undeveloped, in Central America, and they're not really super specialized in terms of, again, they'll nest in a variety of habitats. So, next slide, please. So, again, here are the detection points. I think one factor for this species too, especially in East Galveston Bay, is along these roads there tend to be canals, and those canals tend to have shrubby, either tallow or some of them have a little bit of like lime prickly ash, and so there's just scruffy habitat that they can use to nest. And I guess another caveat, especially with buntings, um, a singing male painted bunting doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually nesting. It just means that a male painted bunting found a spot he thinks looks great, and is singing his heart out, hoping a lady finds it. So I don't know. I think they're very, especially in East Galveston Bay, I think they're very kind of boom and bust. If there are a lot of them around and it's good weather, they'll nest. But I think based on, what I've read historically, they kind of come and go a little bit in terms of the density that we see, at least on the Bolivar Peninsula and kind of the surrounding area. Next slide, please. This is 2024. There were just a ton of them down the survey. The treatment transect, there were just a ton of them once you got past the entrance to Anahuac. I think too, mid-May could still be the migratory period, and so it might be a little early to say that all these birds were going to actually settle there. And that might also be why we had that peak in 2024, because if I remember, I didn't really see very many painted buntings migrating through High Island that year, even though we had a lot of good weather to ground them. And so even by that survey date, some of these may have just been migrants that were still passing through. Last slide, please. So then, yeah, they kind of dropped back in 25 when things also kind of dried out just a little bit. Next slide, please. In Colorado River, I kind of mentioned earlier the ladderback woodpeckers and the common ground doves. I think this is an area that in the next decade or so, depending on what the development does, I mean, this is where we're going to see a lot more painted buntings, because this is going to become more and more shrubland habitat versus just prairie habitat, at least across the region broadly. Just as the Wasatch and the mesquite continues to kind of march its way outward. Next slide. So again, things are kind of shuffling a little bit, but I think almost on this route, almost all of the points there were several points that had a bird every single season, which was kind of interesting too. So there were definitely birds returning to sing at the same territory. Next slide, please. So they increased a little more smoothly than the other surveys. Next slide. So this will be the last of the maps and the really deep dive, but Dick Sissel. And if you notice, this map is kind of similar to the bobwhite. Dick Sissels are an interesting bird to me because I grew up in New Mexico and I first started birding in New Mexico. And for us, Dick Sissel is a pretty good bird. I mean, we get them in fall as flyovers, but in northeastern New Mexico, we get them as a breeding bird if the conditions are really dry to the east, in Oklahoma and Texas. And very rarely is it dry in Oklahoma and Texas and not dry in New Mexico. So we'd get a handful of pairs. There'd be one or two maybe singing males in the state. Some years there were none. But then every now and then we'd have a year where there were dozens. And again, I think it had to do with the monsoon. But as things kind of dry out, they really like broadleaf vegetation. So this is a bird that I find at least the males like to sing from corn and sorghum fields. I don't know how well they do in terms of actually nesting. My guess is probably not very, because there's a lot of pesticide input. And whenever they decide to harvest, and if the timing's not right, you're going to have a lot of chopped up Dick Sissels mixed in with the corn that you're harvesting. So I think it's kind of an ecological trap in that it looks good for them, but then once they nest in it, they don't really do very well. Next slide, please. So kind of similar. Really, the peak was across all but the Victoria Prairie route, which really doesn't have many dick thistles to begin with. It's kind of just on the edge of where it's getting drier, and a lot of that prairie, frankly, it was the treatment prairie, right? So it was actually really good grassland. They really like broadleaf vegetation, and there wasn't a whole lot of that on that route. And so 2024 was kind of the boom year for most of the transects, and then kind of fell off at the next year. These guys, they do occasionally overwinter, but they migrate relatively far. I mean, they migrate farther than the painted buntings. They're going much further south in South America. And so they're an example of a longer distance migrant that only spends some of its time here. And they're also kind of declining overall. They are a species that is moving northward. And so if you look at the northern Great Plains, they do have more dick thistles nesting there now than they did 30, 40 years ago. For most species in general, a lot of species are moving northward. But the number that their abundance that's increasing in the northern part of their range is not enough to actually make up for the declines at the core of their range. And that was a new, actually an eBird data was used for a paper that was recently published that kind of went through a whole suite of North American birds, using data like this point count data, BBS data that's in eBird, and basically in comparing it to the strict BBS data. And it kind of basically said that eBird data can be used to make really important, scientific and management decisions, because it's showing us the same thing from these BBS data routes, or BBS routes, excuse me. But also that, yes, birds are moving north, but they're not actually replacing the declines. And so, not all birds are declining at the same rate. Not all birds are even declining, but a lot of them are. And so, again, this is another, migratory birds tend to get hit the hardest. But in our region, a lot of the resident birds are also getting hit kind of hard, because when the habitat goes, it's hard for a mottled duck to live in a place that doesn't have any wetlands anymore. Next slide, please. So these are the detections. We can go quicker through these ones. So this is 2023. This is 2024. And this is 2025. And there wasn't a huge change. Again, kind of like with the painted bunting, especially on that northern route, the control, all along that first straightaway, you're right along an irrigation canal. And so there's a lot of not only shrubby habitat, but there tend to also be in those fields. It really wasn't usually active agriculture, but there often was a lot of broadleaf vegetation that was usually full of dick thistles because it looked really good. And then as they flooded it, or as the summer went on, a lot of that habitat kind of went away. But at least when the surveys were conducted, it was good habitat. So next slide. And this is the kind of interesting one. Pay attention to that right-hand transect. So this is 2023. Next slide. It's 2024. Next slide. And this is 2025. So again, 2024, I think the crops, when they planted, were just right. Things weren't really all that tall, but it was just the perfect habitat when I was running the survey, that dick thistles were just everywhere. Next slide. So the last bird I'm going to talk about, and we're not going to go through the maps because I basically had an eastern meadowlark at every point for most of these surveys, which is a wonderful thing. But eastern meadowlark, they are also showing declines, not quite as precipitous as some of the other species. But I think a lot of this has more to do with development necessarily than habitat, just because they can deal with, they seem to be able to deal with mesquite and weesach and a little more shrubs than maybe the bobwhite or the dick thistles can. Next slide, please. So lots of eastern meadowlarks. Like I said, almost every point. I could have done a map with the points that didn't have eastern meadowlarks. Most points had eastern meadowlarks, with the exception of the weird thing was the treatment route for Colorado River didn't really have a whole lot of meadowlarks. And I don't really know the answer to that. I think oftentimes a lot of that habitat was flooded. And so with a couple of there were a couple of, I guess they were rice farms that were flooded. And so those obviously didn't have any meadowlarks on them, but don't really have an answer. But they kind of held pretty steady or increased a little bit in some of the routes with the rain. But again, prairie health and grazing, a lot of these areas that weren't agricultural land, so a lot of the treatment areas had grazing rather than just straight corn, or sorghum, which is usually a good thing because there's usually more habitat than ag. But it may be that the grazing plots of the treatment area just weren't necessarily jiving with what the meadowlarks liked, but it is what it is. Next slide, please. So again, I'm not going to go through the maps just because all the points basically had a meadowlark on them. I think actually first and foremost, before I kind of leave you guys with these takeaways, I do want to say that, again, point counts, not everyone has to love them. But I'm sure there's a couple people that are listening that may be into like the Texas Century Club and a lot in county birding. And point counts are really the bread and butter of eBird data. I know it's fun to be at a single place, like Smith Oaks, for example, in the middle of the spring migration and spend 5 hours walking around and get 100 birds, or excuse me, 100 species. But that, for data purposes and for generating like those trends maps and for seeing how birds are responding to the landscape, that data, there's a limited amount that we can do with it. On the other hand, if you are birding a county that's super underbirded or an area that's underbirded, and your goal is to see, you're trying to get your county century or whatever, instead of e-birding the entire road that you drive for 3 hours as a single point in the middle, consider breaking that up, do a point count. Kind of the standard minimum time is 3 minutes because that's what the breeding bird survey is. And so oftentimes if I stop and I don't really see anything, I'll give it 3 minutes and I'll move on. If you stop and you happen to find something really cool, like a greater roadrunner where there shouldn't be a greater roadrunner, or a white-tipped dove where there should be a white-tipped dove, you can spend more time, if you're not doing a formal survey. But that sort of repetitive, high quality data, stationary data, is really what drives a lot of the modeling. And so, even breeding bird survey, it's a volunteer effort. We're lucky that it's theoretically still happening. That, the department of the USGS that is in charge of all that is tiny and basically had no budget to start with. And now they actually have no budget. So we'll see if it continues in the future. But there's no reason why we can't bring this data to eBird just, for fun, basically. As birders and observers out in the field, eBird has a lot of power, and eBird's as good as the data that we give it. And so if more people think about, how am I generating data and contributing data, I think it'll make it even more powerful. But kind of broadly speaking, for this specific effort, a lot of the threats for one region were kind of the same for others, if that makes sense. So energy development is kind of a big, or even just suburban sprawl is kind of a big issue for a lot of our coastal prairie, in Texas, because it's relatively flat and relatively easy to put a house on. And so, that looks different in different places. There's not quite as big a problem yet in East Galveston Bay, but energy development is kind of on the horizon. And in that Colorado River area, as Houston continues to grow west, there's a big energy demand and there's a big demand for places for people to live. So over time, we're going to see more and more changes, and really just how dry it is. I mean, if there's not water on the landscape, the shorebirds aren't going to make it to the Arctic. Those mottled ducks aren't going to be able to raise their chicks. Um, that's a big problem. And to that end, I think the biggest takeaway from me for this whole enterprise was that precipitation kind of had the biggest impact, it seemed, whether it was a control route or a route that is being managed as a conservation land. If you don't have rain, it's going to be tough. If you have rain, things do pretty well everywhere. But when you don't have rain, those conservation lands are probably going to bounce back a lot faster than the lands that aren't where conservation or at least habitat is not a component in the management decisions. And again, not all species are going to react the same to one prescribed management because not all species live in the same kind of habitat. And so you probably don't need to worry as much about painted buntings because they have a little more flexibility in what they like. The dick sissels and the mottled ducks are going to have a harder time because they like a slightly more specific habitat. And I should mention things like lark sparrows and scissor-tailed flycatchers are pretty good at using the same habitat that the painted buntings do, and that's kind of why I didn't go into detail with them because their trends looked pretty much the same in terms of the surveys as the painted buntings. And another kind of big red flag to me is that both neotropical migrants and resident birds are declining. Dick sissels are declining and mottled ducks are declining. So we can't save migrants by ourselves. They connect us to the rest of the world. That's kind of one of the great things about birds is, as cool as it is to see a painted bunting, that painted bunting doesn't live in a vacuum. It has to go south, and it connects us to Central America and the spaces and people that live and work there. But there are birds like mottled duck that we have a little more control over, and we're not even necessarily doing enough to help them. So hopefully we can bend that curve and reverse the trend. And again, conservation doesn't happen in a bubble, but you have to start at home. And so the first thing that we can do is engage in projects like this that generate not only data, but also like do something on the ground to maintain these habitats and to get more people talking and thinking at least about, how do I ensure that, kids that are growing up, and maybe become birders or naturalists now, or, grandchildren, how are your grandchildren? What are they going to inherit? Are they going to get to see a mottled duck, nesting on the coastal prairie or a painted bunting singing out on the prairie? So that's what I got. I'm happy to answer questions, and I think we're a little over time, but I'll turn it over to the moderators to.
All right. Thank you, Wyatt. That was wonderful, very informative. Thank you for taking the time to put all of that data together. I know that took some time. I also wanted to recognize, and I should have done this in the beginning, the Gulf Coast Joint Venture is a wonderful program, and Steve DeMasso was the monitoring and sea grip coordinator, which was the Coastal Grasslands Restoration Incentive Program coordinator. Steve DeMasso actually passed away last year, but Steve is who trained us and led his staff in helping us to establish these routes. And they had really talented GIS staff who looked at lands. We tried to put the treatment route at least astride lands that are already protected or that we knew had good chances of getting under conservation easement or already a refuge of some sort. And then there was some prediction we were trying to make in the control routes that did not have a project or federal protected lands of any sort. And those were more likely to have development. So again, our thanks to the Gulf Coast Joint Venture staff. And we also wanted to mention that Texas Coastal Prairie Initiative was funded by the USDA NRCS. As Elisa mentioned, it's wrapping up in the next several months, but we do intend to reapply, and we want to continue with the Texas Coastal Prairie Initiative, and we want to continue collecting this data because obviously we know 3 years is not a very large slice of time for analyzing bird populations. So we hope that all of you help as volunteers, as Wyatt mentioned, and we hope to re-engage Wyatt once we get funding for the Texas Coastal Prairie Initiative for the years to come. All right, and we do have a couple questions for those of you who are still with us. Lee and Chris Melson asked Wyatt, would it be a list at each point, and are you stationary?
Yes. And I guess I should have qualified too. I know some folks will, I think there's been differing guidance throughout the years. I do, even for my breeding bird surveys, I do each point is stationary and it's for that amount of time and it's all that's going into eBird. What a lot of folks do that don't want to do that, or at least they don't want to enter 50 points worth of data, or in this case, 30 points worth of data, is they'll amalgamate 10 points. So you just add, you do your stops if you're doing a BBS route. You do for your first 10 stops, you enter that as a location that's in the middle. So it'll be stop 5, and it'll just your location will be called, that would be a traveling list, and it would just be 1 through 10, and you put all that in there. But if you're just doing it for fun, yeah, stationary, 3 to 5 minutes. If you see some cool birds, stay longer, that's fine. Multiples of 3 are kind of nice because then they can still be used. It can still kind of be analyzed like the breeding bird survey route, which is part of the reason why this was a 6-minute point count. I know that because you can basically break it out as 2 separate BBS exposures or surveys. I know that there's a new, I think it's a 5-minute point count, but it's part of Project Climate Watch, which I think is an Audubon initiative, National Audubon, and it's kind of a similar deal. But yeah, stationary, 3 or more minutes, and half a mile apart is good, just because you're less likely to be hearing things from multiple points. What I do is I just find a road that looks cool on Google Maps, and I'll start out doing like every mile, and then if I get bored after 3 or 4 counts, I'll just go until I just track on my odometer and go until I find some cool looking habitat and stop there. And it doesn't have to be as rigorous as 30 points, but
Right. But yeah, collecting more precise data at each point rather than a running count along an entire road, like you said, is certainly more helpful for scientists who are tracking these populations. All
and
right.
different times of year too. I mean, it doesn't have to
Yeah.
be in the summer.
Right. Let's see. Petra mentioned Calhoun County has lost all rice fields due to the ending of subsidies. The difference in shorebird numbers is dramatic. And she thanked you for your presentation. Marianne Feeney also thanked you. Jesse Malowitz asked, when you do your point counts, do you collect data on things such as invasive species and changes year to year on your vegetation metrics?
So for the Texas Coastal Prairie Initiative points, no, but well, not specifically invasive versus non-invasive, but the extent was definitely, which I guess in hindsight, I kind of got lucky because most of the points were either on the control routes were, for the most part, like ag land. And so it was either a dirt field or it had corn in it or sorghum, for a lot of them. And then for the managed habitat for the most part was like really nice. Mostly really good prairie, especially like Victoria Prairie, that I think is JR or J2 Ranch Road. I highly recommend anyone who just wants to go birding down there. It was a really nice road. Just don't go on a weekday because you'll have a million. Um, Maybe they finished the wind farm or solar farm or whatever they were building, but you'll have a lot of cars first thing in the morning. But anyway, um, a lot of for breeding bird survey, a lot of the correlation from habitat change, I think, is kind of baked in just because the birds are changing. Um, that doesn't have a specific vegetation component. I guess I didn't incorporate it, and it would have been kind of interesting. The other thing that you recorded are the number of cars that pass. And so as areas get built up, that's kind of a proxy for how, you know, developed an area is some of these breeding bird survey routes, for example, have been done for 50, 60, 70 years, 60 years. Um, and when they first did them, it was a dirt road and they never had any cars coming by. And now some of these points that I do on my routes, it's on a highway and you get three birds and 50 cars. So
Yep. Yeah. Mm. All right. Court Hall asked, city parks getting that spacing half a mile is a challenge. Is doing presence only versus point counts considered useful to understand bird populations with land management in smaller acreage areas?
the smaller the area, the finer scale you're going to need to be. I'll put it that way. So it definitely is still worth, yeah, parks generating data in parks, especially in a place like Houston that is so fragmented, is really important. But for that, I would say, beyond just presence absence, really numbers are really important in that sense because you are generating data from a single point within kind of an urban landscape. I will say the traveling point counts it is more conducive to we're traveling by car and we're driving a county road somewhere or a farm to market road. Um, so within Houston, if you could do stationary counts in the kind of the pocket parks, that is useful because again, it is stationary, or at least you're not moving very far, and so it's easier to analyze if it's stationary complete checklist with numbers. I'll just put it that way. um, Stationary complete with numbers. X's, avoid X's unless you're not counting. I'll just put it that way. But if you aren't counting, don't put numbers.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Getting those trends on numbers of individual birds, definitely important. Jocelyn asked, what again is the name of that road in Victoria County that was good for birding?
I think it's J2 Ranch Road. And then it goes into Jackson County and it becomes a different named road, but I think it's J2 or JR.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can't remember. Yeah.
It's a cool road. I just stumbled into it and it turns out it is like a hot spot that other people bird all the time. But yeah, it's just basically just wet. I think it's JR. It's just it there's it intersects with Highway 77 and then it intersects with the farm to market highway. And the transit was at the farm to market intersection and then went eastward. But even between 77 and that farm to market, I had Paraques along that section too. And it's really, I mean, Lavaca County is like right there and DeWitt County is right there. It's really just that tri-county intersection. So just a really weird, interesting area where the prairie and the shrublands kind of converge. There's probably green jays in there. I never had one, but it was on my watch list.
Yeah. All right. Scott Buchel asked, did I notice that the treatment areas had generally fewer birds than the control areas? And was that expected?
For some of the species, yes. And it's not necessarily expected, but I would argue that, like, for example, the dickcissels, the thing that was really driving dickcissel numbers in the control areas was the corn and sorghum. So you have this like that the habitat is better for that one particular species, but it's not necessarily good habitat. I would argue it's a trap because they're not going to actually be very successful when these fields are getting sprayed with pesticide every week, and once they decide to harvest with machinery, the nests are going to get destroyed. So I didn't include it, but if you really do a curve, I think the treatment areas had a much more natural distribution and abundance of birds than the controls, because the controls had such modified habitat that things were a lot more boom and bust. And then, yeah, it's great to have 100 dick sissels, but the next year there were very few dick sissels, so it really wasn't great habitat. But it is also 3 years. It's kind of a short time frame, and again, the precipitation had a greater effect, I think.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah. All right. Virgil asked, it seemed like in many cases the treatment transect did not do better than the control transect. Does that indicate the conservation lands were not, quote, successful? So similar question.
I think it's up for interpretation. It was kind of surprising, but again, for the same token, the general trend year to year was that the rainfall was kind of driving the difference. And again, especially for like dick sissels, the boom and bust was a lot more dramatic in the control. So they did really well one year, and then they did significantly worse the next, compared to the treatment where it was much more kind of level, which I would argue is what you kind of want. But
Yeah, yeah. And I'm thinking long term for conservation in Texas, of course, if these farm fields, which aren't great habitat, become any sort of developed property, obviously those bird populations drop off precipitously. So,
and yeah, again, not a whole lot of great answers, just kind of interesting observations. But
yep.
the component I don't know and would be interesting to look at is the age of those treatment lands compared to the control. So I would be surprised if the agricultural land within the control transect, I would be surprised if those farms were new. I'll put it that way. Like, I think those have probably been farms for a long time. The conservation easements are not necessarily as old as that farm, if that makes sense. So that farm habitat has been there for a much longer period of time than this new prairie habitat that's being managed as prairie. And so those birds that have been nesting in the farm habitat for several years, they're going to want to continue to come back to that territory and defend it. And so I think 3 years is a kind of a short period of time to see birds fill the whatchamacallit, they're not going to
Restored
reach
habitat.
carrying capacity right away. So, but
Yeah.
I think having it would be I would be very interested to see how birds react to like a hard drought year, and see how maybe the control lands do okay just because they're being irrigated in a lot of, and there's wet corn. But the dick sissel still might prefer that. But mottled ducks did not do very well. They liked the treatment because there was water. And I guess even the spot with the control that they were on, I mean, that's a rice farm in East Galveston Bay. Like, mottled ducks did not show up, on any random cornfield in the Colorado River Prairie. So,
Right. Yeah. All right. I think we got to all the questions. You
cool.
got a bunch of thank yous in the comments. And I think our high point for the webinar tonight was 98 attendees. So that's pretty good. All righty.
Thank you, Wyatt. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for letting me get out there and look at birds. It was a great way to spend, a weekend in June, just out there and listening to dick sissels and painted buntings, and
That's all right.
so Thank you. And thank you guys for actually doing all the legwork and, you know, being a part of this initiative to actually manage lands for birds. I just got to reap the benefits.
Awesome. That's a
I
win-win.
do hope those conservation areas get bigger and longer management. I think those are all great long-term goals.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody.
Mhm.